Padmini and Siti, Yiteng, and Jenny. Good morning. Oh, thanks, Anthony. Anthony, are you going to be able to help me handle all the admitting of people into the session? Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. If there's technical issues, if you can't see the screen that I'm sharing, if you can't hear me, please let me know in the chat. That would be really, really helpful. Okay, while we are waiting for people to come in, I'd like to get to know everybody a little bit. Oh, thanks, Padmini. Great. And if you could head over to the Padlet in the chat link, there are just some questions, and there are a couple of different columns. If you could just tell all of us, share a little bit about where you're from, what you do, that would be really useful. Let me know if you can't access the Padlet as well. Thanks for resharing, Anthony. Okay, we still have people joining us. Good morning, Muthia, Farida.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
Yeah.
Farida, if you don't mind, could I ask you to perhaps mute because we can hear the background noise? Oh, thank you so much. Okay. So oh, great. We have people who are in. We have somebody from India I'm sorry, I have another screen on this side. Gauhati University. If you could put your name at the title, that would be great. Hi, Lisa. Teach students of all ages. Great, thank you so much. So we will be using the Padlet as we go through. I'll talk a little bit about this idea of teaching for transfer in just a little bit. I just want to make sure that we've got people in. Okay, we'll start in a minute because I know we don't have that much time. Thank you, Joanne and Michael. Oh, Japan, great. Awesome. Thanks, Anita. Okay. Okay, so welcome to Teaching for Transfer. And maybe just to start off a little bit, I've been very interested in this notion or this idea of teaching for transfer because I've been teaching now for 18, 19 years, probably not as long as some of you, I know, but long enough that as I teach, there are certain expectations. We want what's the best for our students. We work very hard to equip them, teach them the things that we think they should know. But often we end up frustrated, or at least I end up frustrated because, sometimes we think that they get a concept or they get a skill, they're good at something. But then when we test them or we see the work that they produce, it's not quite the same. Oftentimes, skills in one topic are not used in another topic. So, in spelling, when they read, they see the words, but they can't spell correctly when they write, for example. And at the university, one of the things that we are usually very frustrated with, and I talk a lot to colleagues who teach in the content courses, and that is referencing. We teach academic writing, and we teach the students how to use APA referencing. But when they go to other courses, they seem to forget, or they can't use the referencing accurately, and we get a lot of questions from colleagues. So this idea of teaching for transfer actually has a lot to do with that. And I've got a couple of examples to illustrate this. Some of these examples are mine, some of them are. So one of it has to do with the physics class, and the physics teacher had explained, this idea that if you drop something from the top of a tower and it takes a certain amount of time to land, what are the things that affect the speed of the object and the time taken for it to hit the ground? The same physics teacher gave a similar question, but used the illustration of a 3-kilogram ball dropping in a hole. And the students in his class could not actually answer the question. And when he asked them, they said, oh, but during the lesson, we never talked about dropping balls into holes. Even though the principles used in dropping something from a tower were exactly the same. Another example comes from football or soccer coaching, where the players would do drills and they would practice. But whatever they did during those drills and during those practices were never actually used in an actual football game. And the coach was very frustrated. The coach said, hey, we've done all these things. Why didn't we use them during the actual game? And the players said, oh, because the opposing players were not lined up the same way. It didn't look the same. It's not exactly the same as we did during our drills in our practice. And I've seen this as well. I teach presentation skills, and there was a time where I collaborated with a colleague in a different subject, and the colleague had said, why don't you come in for the students' final presentation for that subject, which was mass communication, and be a co-judge and assess students. I walked into the class and all the students let out this, oh no, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm here to assess your presentation. And then the student said, oh no. And I said, why oh no? And the student said, oh, now I have to use all the things that you taught me in presentation skills. And I said, were you not going to? So that was very frustrating for me. I'm not sure if you have had similar experiences. If you have, put it in the chat. That would be really great to hear. But what we see here are very common scenarios where students are not able to apply the things that they've learned because the context, this new context, is different, right? It's not exactly the same as the context in which they learned something. Or they find that the new context is too complicated. They don't understand it. They don't know, am I supposed to use this concept here? Am I supposed to write in a particular way now? They're confused. And the last one is that students often think in silos. I'm not sure if you've experienced this for yourself. I know this happens a lot. Students will apply knowledge and skills in one subject, but they won't think about applying those same knowledge and skills in a different subject, right? They think that, so for example, whatever I learn in math stays in math. Whatever I learn in science stays in science. Whatever I learn in English stays only in the English class. And that for me is a problem. That for me is a major challenge. So what is teaching for transfer? It's essentially a theory that we should teach students so that they are able to transfer and apply these skills and content learned in one context, which would be our classroom, our lessons, to another context, right? And that context could be, perhaps looks like this, something like this. Other classrooms, it could be other lessons within the same subject. And I think the ultimate one would be when they apply that to real world challenges and issues, right? So let's just take a very quick cursory look at what this research say. I mentioned earlier that we had the wonderful opportunity to have a workshop with Professor Paul Nation, and in his resource on learning and learning language, one of the areas, he talks about 3 areas, quantity, quality, and focus. And under focus, this is what he said: transfer appropriateness. Our learning is more useful if it closely resembles the use that we need to make of what we learn. And oftentimes we sometimes do teaching in silos, and we don't help learners understand why they're learning something and where they should be applying that learning. So this is one idea. So the second idea is from research on something called productive pedagogies, and I'll share the reference at the end. And really, this just says that we help learners understand, when we help learners understand the links to other topics in the same subject, or the link to other subjects or to the real world, their learning improves. So coming back to Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, but more Wiggins. So he suggested that one of the ways to help students understand and transfer the skills and knowledge, so how do we actually teach transfer, is to create what we call complex assessments. So the assessment or the activity has to be challenging. It has to be something that challenges students. It has to make them think. Fantastic if it's situated in the real world. So case studies and scenarios are fantastic. It provides students with the opportunity to think and to do. So those two are very, very important. They need to be thinking. They're not just, they're not doing it mindlessly, but they have to do something. Adaptation is fantastic. Another thing that's really important is for us as instructors, facilitators, teachers, to model the transfer. One of the things that they advocate is something called think aloud, and we have to make explicit the links for learners, right? And we have to repeat the importance of transferring, of applying that learning. Okay, so I've covered a bunch of things. I don't want to assume that there are no questions, so I'm just going to stop sharing temporarily. Okay, there's stuff in the chat. Let me just see. Oh, thank you, Patmi, for that. You face the same problems with the transfer of referencing skills. It's so good to know that we're not alone. Anthony, you're a student in this scenario. Hopefully you learned something from today's workshop too. Yes, they don't see how one idea relates to another. Thank you, Patmini. Okay, Lisa. So to make it explicit just means to actually tell students that there is something or somewhere outside of the classroom, outside of the lesson, that they can apply the skill to. We'll get to some examples after this, so hopefully that will help with covering some of the different things that we can do to help students transfer. Okay, so great. If you have any other questions, if I'm going too fast, please do let me know. Don't want to assume that everybody's okay with the content. Okay, so we're going on to a task. And if you're already on the Padlet, let me see if everybody's there. We've got Anthony. Thank you, Anthony, for filling that up as well. That's great. We've got Jenny, who's teaching Year 9 students. Okay, so that's 15-year-olds, right? Jane, thank you, Jane, and Yiting. Okay, so we've got a couple of people who've already started sharing, but if you could share a lesson that you would like to work on as we go through this idea of teaching for transfer. So I put in an example for mine, and we can look at others along the way. So I'd like to do this as a little bit of a collaborative piece. Put down the things that you find your students not transferring. So if there are particular skills or concepts or ideas that you find that your students don't transfer well, or you think this is really, really important, and I want my students to be able to apply these outside of just my lessons. I mean, I guess kind of the baseline or the kind of a minimum would be students applying what we teach them successfully during assessments. So if you've got coursework, the students take what you cover in your lessons and apply that to coursework, or taking that and applying it to the final exam. So that's one way of thinking about transfer. But I'd like to maybe push a little bit and say, are there things that you teach your students that you think are valuable, useful for them to use outside your subject, outside your classroom? And what could those be? So if you could fill up that second, maybe let me just show that on the screen. Yep. So this second column, so please share a lesson you are considering designing for transfer. And if some people could put those down, and then we can talk about that. Thank you, Anita. So maybe, Anita, if I could just ask you a follow-up question. What about expository and argumentative essays would you like students to transfer? How do you envision students transferring the skills learned in an argumentative essay, for example?
This is basically a new course because
Sure.
we have just redesigned our curriculum. Previously, that course was separate courses, expository, and then the next semester is argumentative. And so I'm looking forward to this, but I'm planning to just somebody give me an idea, and it's a great idea that I would not only the skills, the referencing skills, but also the strategy to put forward a good acquisition or argumentation. Like at first advertisements would be a good authentic materials. we could find both exposition and argumentative styles in ads, and also perhaps speech, like political speech. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, those sound like really good applications for both the expository and argumentative skills.
Yeah.
I guess the question I have would be, would students need to do ads or give speeches as part of other courses within their program?
Perhaps in the speaking course, yes, they would have to make that speech.
Great.
But in my course, then they would need to write that. Yeah.
Right. So maybe I'll if you don't mind, I'll use your example to talk about to answer one of the questions that Lisa had. So one of the ways that we can help learners by making things explicit is when we are doing, for example, argumentative. And part of argumentative is structure, right? So we say, how do we structure the argument? And when we're teaching students that, or we're going through that material with students, we would say, this skill of putting together the argument, of having, here are my points, here are the counterpoints, here's how we rebut, is something that you will use when you go and take the course on speaking, right? So you are making that explicit link between what they are learning now with something that they are going to learn in the future.
Yeah, right. Even though I'm not teaching speaking on listening, but I cannot avoid also letting them hear, speeches as, to trigger their ideas, how to write argumentative essay.
Yes. So the idea of doing the transfer is that we help them to transfer. They might not. So I think a lot of the times, I mean, I'm guilty of this. I make the assumption that my students can see the links to other things, whether it's another subject or something that they could use in real life.
Yeah.
But a lot of the times, our students don't see it. We see it, but our students don't see it. And so in a sense, our role or our job is to help them see those links. And that's a very important part of this idea of teaching for transfer.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm just going through what's on Padlet.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you, Anita, for sharing.
Sure.
Yeah, Lisa, if you have something to add, please do.
Yes, I was actually just thinking with Anita what she said in terms of argumentative and expository. Something else that she could do that would be really good is to provide a lot of models in terms of, even advertisements could be one, magazine covers. So you'd want to take your advertisements and then look at it in forms of media in terms of print. And then having students even just putting, let's say if you've got 4 or 5 different magazine ads, and then putting them around the room and then asking them to look at it and observe it and see which ones they would be more likely, if it was a product, for example, which ones they would be more likely to buy, which ones not, and then give evidence for why. And then in terms of argumentative essays, you could just take a piece and then take different parts of it. So you might just want to break it down into like introductions, and then look at 4 or 5 different introductions and have students do a ranking system of, if they have this essay, which one would they want? Which one would they be more likely to read first? And that's where, if you are highlighting, I think someone else had mentioned that they're looking at thesis statements. What would be really good is that you would have 4 or 5 different introductions of different essays, and then have it rank. Okay, this one I would read first, and this one I would read second. This one I'm not more likely, but then they would have to provide reasons for why they would read that one first. And from there, you can talk about why was this stronger, why was it weaker. And I think, I don't know, that's my 2 cents worth on it.
Thanks, Lisa. Yes. So I mean, I think there are multiple ways to do that. And thank you for sharing some ideas. I think that's really useful. Other people, please feel free to chime in if there are things that you've done or if there are things that you can see that would help students to be able to understand that the things that they're learning must be used elsewhere, right? So I just coming back to some of the things that I talked about. So some people have shared what they would like to design. If there are more, please do put that in. I think we just like to talk through some of these things as well. So the first thing is situated in the real world. And sometimes this is a lot harder because of the curriculum that we have, but it is something that we need to consider to help students understand where are you going to use this in your daily life, right? So I did think about argumentative, one that could perhaps be a little closer for our students is if they are on social media, people like to put comments on YouTube, on Facebook, and they get into an argument with somebody. Knowing how to construct a good argument is then very useful, right? In defending or upholding your point as opposed to somebody else's. So being able to give students things like this, I find, is helpful. It's helpful for them to think beyond, because then when they are faced with situations that are not the same as the classroom, they might consider, okay, there's a skill that I know or that I've learned, and maybe I can use that here. So these are some of the strategies. This is actually not the whole list. The whole list is a lot longer, and we wouldn't be able to cover everything, but I'll share the resource later on. And hopefully you will find those other ideas useful as well. But if we go back to Padlet, perhaps if you've already picked a topic that you would like to design or redesign, perhaps think about what are the strategies. So there were a few different strategies there. What strategies could be used for this purpose? Khadija, yes, project-based learning. Project-based learning is a instructional approach, and we use the projects, but maybe very specific to skills and content. How do we help our students facilitate the idea of transfer even through that project-based approach? Yeah. Yes. So Padmini, thank you. Yeah, social media. I think if we can link stuff to social media, TikTok, it's very useful. It gives students, okay, definitely outside of the classroom. Lisa, yes, persuade future bosses. Though I'm not sure. Maybe Anthony can help. How often do students think about future bosses? I'm not so sure. Sure, no problem, Padmini. Okay, so perhaps you can think a little bit about strategies and what kind of strategies we can use there. And then we can talk a little bit about whether those would be effective or not effective. So one of the things I put down under reflections for the next part is, how do we know if we are successful? Okay, so even as you're thinking about strategies, consider what are the different ways in which we can know that students are actually able to transfer. Okay, I'm just giving people some think time. If you have questions, please feel free to ask questions. I initially was going to do thesis statements as well, because I know a lot of students struggle with thesis statements. So anybody, any ideas on how we can help students transfer this idea of writing a thesis statement to other things? Because it's actually really a very useful tool, not just for academic writing, but also in the way that we communicate our ideas. Jane, you're muted if you're trying to say something.
Oh, sorry. I was, yes, I was trying to say that I am struggling with different groups of students with thesis statement. Some groups are okay, some are not, and very often um, it is during the assessment that I realized that they actually couldn't really write a very clear thesis statement. So uh, so from the lesson itself, I thought they could, and from even the activities, the feedback given, they seem to have understood what thesis statement is. But when I see their research paper, and I say no, this is not what thesis statement is. So sometimes I do wonder the weaker group of students what went wrong, and actually how I could really make the lesson of thesis statement more effective, not for all, but for the weaker students. I still think that there may be some things that I could do.
Great, thanks, Jane. So I think there are two parts to this, right? So one is proficiency, but one, especially for students who are who demonstrate that they're able to do it during practice, but then are not able to do the same thing when they have to do the assessment, the research paper, and so on. The question is, why are they not able to do something that they seem to have done fairly well in the classroom, in this now probably more difficult piece that you're being assessed on? So I think one of the things that I probably would try and is to give them a harder task in class, right? Is there a way that we can give them a harder task in class? Is there a way that we can provide something that's more complex, whether they are picking it out from a reading piece or they are having to write out that thesis statement for more complex ideas? That perhaps could be a way. But Mini, you have something to add? Thank you.
I just wanted to add that what I find a problem is that students, when they learn about thesis statements, it's usually not in their own context of research. So when they are actually, apologies for my voice, I have COVID. So when they begin doing their own research work, I start off with giving them, some possible thesis statements, and then we go through an exercise where we look at each and decide which one is a good thesis statement and which one isn't, based on what I have taught to them earlier. And then I make them, they do it in pairs and in small groups. They work out the pros and the cons of each thesis statement, and then they start phrasing. I encourage them to rephrase them or design their own statements, and we go through the same exercise until we are satisfied that what they have produced is a good thesis statement, at least good to a certain extent. if not perfect. I find this exercise useful with my students, master students, as well as the beginner PhD students. Thank you.
Thanks, Padmini. I'm not sure if that's helpful, Jane, but yeah, do consider some of those things. I think we've got a couple more. So introduce webinar speakers and moderate discussions. Sure. And I think a question that I have for everyone is, are we able to find out if students are actually able to transfer the skills and knowledge, the content, to other things? So sometimes it might not happen in our classrooms. It might have to happen outside the classroom. But are there ways in which we can still know? Because if we don't know if they are transferring, then we are not sure if our strategies are useful. I think Jane's example, she knows that something is not right and therefore needs to be worked on. And that's why assessment is useful. We get to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this didn't quite work. What else can I do? But for things that are outside of the classroom, how could we find out what students are doing in order to assess if they are transferring? So we've got something in chat. Oh, so Lisa has a suggestion for thesis statements. Michael, ask them. Great. Thanks, Anthony. That's also a cue for me to be wrapping up. Thank you for that. Michael, if you could elaborate, that would be great. How would you ask them once they've left your classroom, once you're no longer teaching them?
Oh, hi.
Hi.
I would, we did recently we did an academic writing class, research paper that they need to submit, and we did moves, rhetorical moves in argumentation, specifically with regards to what you mentioned earlier on about raising opposing views and countering opposing views. Yeah, and you would imagine that it should be reproduced in the essay. When it doesn't, you try to make connections with other things so that you increase the motivation of the learners, because you don't want them to be just stuck within the four walls of the classroom, right? So I would, in the next class, come in and pick out a controversial issue which is current and is happening in the classroom and outside the classroom, like the Ukraine-Russian war or the assassination of an ex-prime minister, right? And then I'll get them to have a discussion about these issues, raise opposing views, and then question, right? Question whether they're able to extend the criticalities and critical rhetorical moves that they have learned in their essays and apply it to the world that they are experiencing and living in. In other words, how do they draw distinctions between propaganda and persuasion? How do they assess the different positions and stances being produced by different newspapers and reports about a particular situation or phenomenon that is happening? So they need to then, present that opinion as a group, right? And then I would Socratically moderate that, right? So I think thinking aloud requires teachers to not just be organizing lessons and reproducing stuff, but also to facilitate. All right, so you can just ask them questions, and you can sense whether they're able to apply the thinking skills and moves in the writing to the larger world outside the classroom.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Yeah, I definitely agree with bringing in, current events and current affairs to be able to provide that external context for students. I know sometimes it isn't the easiest to do in the classes that we have because we are often chasing completion of certain things. But I think those are great opportunities to highlight to students again the importance of the skills beyond the classroom. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. Thank you everyone for sharing. Please do add on more if you have to the Padlet. I noticed that quite a few people have left emails. I will send you the pack of resources after this. Perhaps we might only get to you on Monday, but yes, I will get those to you. So we've done the task, and Anthony just told me that I probably need to wrap up so that you can move on to your next workshop. Just wanted to check if there were any questions that any of you have, any further thoughts on this idea of teaching for transfer. Okay, I'm guessing that means no. So these were the two main references for some of the things I was sharing today, but I'll put that in the pack for those of you who have left your email. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful in some way, at least to perhaps trigger if you're redesigning or thinking about what you're teaching next, that you are thinking about how you can help students to transfer skills and content that you take so much time and effort to help them learn, that they are able to transfer that over to the next thing that they're doing, or hopefully for the rest of their life. I mean, I think we are all very idealistic that way, but I know definitely I am. Thank you for joining this, and I will see you all back in the main room at 11:35. Please do go on to the next session. Thank you, and see you. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Nick. See you later.
See you. If you're not sure where to go, please let me know, and hopefully we can get some help to you.